This Friday, I'm going to go on with the theme I developed the last time we're together. I started reading to you from a book chapter, and the title of the chapter was My Jewish Antisemitism. But I didn't get finished, so I'm going to pick up where I left off. I think I'll back up one little paragraph to get a running start, and then I'll go on. And I will finish with that today and go on to another topic. So I'll do a teaser right now. The other topic is the use of airplane tickets in the conduct of psychotherapy. That's going to be my later conversation today. All right, let me back up with my Jewish anti Semitism, and I'm referring to World War II. Then the war ended. Then I saw the newsreels of troops entering the death camps, an overwhelming number of dead Jewish bodies, many naked, some in their striped pajamas, uniforms, bodies piled up like cordwood because the guards had fled before the dead could be cremated or buried. Bulldozers pushing a myriad of corpses at a time into a mass grave. Workers sprinkling powdered lye on the corpses to disinfect and to prevent disease, and then bulldozers pushing earth back again to cover over these final resting places. Those liberated inmates, still alive, could barely move about. They were emaciated from extreme starvation and looked as if they might die at any moment, which indeed some did. The sights were riveting, the sights were unbearable. In 1948, the second set of events that made me proud of my Jewish identity unfolded. Soon after Great Britain turned over the quote, protectorate of Palestine, close quotes, to the United Nations and withdrew troops and governments from the area, the Jews in Palestine declared the existence of the State of Israel. President Truman gave the new government diplomatic recognition, and the United Nations gave the new state official sanction. War between the Jews and their Arab neighbors immediately flared. Somehow, against all odds, the small number of Jews in that tiny area, augmented by Jews from other countries who found their ways to get there to help, managed to fight off the combined armies of Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and to keep fighting until a truce was negotiated. It seemed to me a miracle as great as the biblical story of Hanukkah, an oil lamp that somehow kept burning for 8 days when there was only oil for one day. I had been so obsessed with the unfolding news stories that at age 17, I had seriously considered trying to get abroad to help out with the fighting. And that was my last belief in that or any other holy war. In retrospect, for more recent years of my life, it has become clear to me that there was a great symbolism for me in the narrative of Israel's founding. This was a story of small, puny Arthur, who had been beaten up over and over again by the Catholic bullies, somehow finding the means and the resolve to fight back, not only fiercely but successfully, and to give the bullies at least at last the thrashing they deserved. So, what has happened to my Jewishness since I became an adult? It remains very complicated. Along the way, I could no longer continue to sustain a belief in a deity. Can I be an ethnic Jew if I have no real religion? I don't know the answer. Do I have to define myself as a Jew because the world will do so anyhow? I don't know that answer either. Maybe I should just make peace and call myself an ethnic Jewish atheist, whatever that might mean. But I still don't like being Jewish because if I'm Jewish, don't I have to be a supporter of the state of Israel? And I'm not. My love affair with what I thought was a significant movement, a magnificent achievement, has long ago gone south. What was once a liberal socialist democracy, settled mainly by Eastern European Jewish intellectuals, now has a government that is in the thrall of right wing Jews with extreme Orthodox religious belief and of Jews from Iran and North Africa who never assimilated as strongly with liberal social commitments. I can't stand the endless building of settlements over lands that came under Jewish control during the several wars it has now fought. I don't condone that Israel, in effect, resists the founding of an Arab state for the people who call themselves Palestinians, but have no national state to complete their identity. I don't like what I call bullshit rhetoric from Israel's religious right that various texts in the Old Testament provide some kind of legitimate basis for what the Israeli government is now is or not doing. I'm ashamed of people who are supposed to be my people and act this way, taking the lands away from other people. And what of God? I want to say some more. Why did my belief in God die? Well, it's not simple. First of all, as is true for so many, I could not reconcile the image of a God who is supposedly omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent, and yet watches over and permits the horrors of human life on this planet. This was particularly true for me as a Jew whose cohort was supposed to be the chosen ones. And how is it conceivable that over the eons of our existence as Homo sapiens, most human rampages leading to the killing of the largest number of us humans has been done by those who are claiming to be following the dictates of and paying homage to some deity or deities? If there were to be a god or some other deities, he, she, they would be weeping in dismay at the action of us who are supposedly revering them. My transit through college swept away any remaining vestiges of belief in a superior being. I was a philosophy minor as an undergraduate. I particularly loved reading the British philosophers of the 18th century. The debates between George Berkeley and David Hume about the nature of evidence, about the universe, and about the presence or absence of the deity were quite moving for me. Later in graduate school, I spent some time absorbing the thought of a variety of existential philosophers whose writing helped solidify my belief as an atheist and also led me to make some kind of peace with the fact that there was no life other than this one. What was immortal in me was not something called a soul. No, it was all the atoms that had uniquely come together and composed my body that were truly immortal. In whatever altered forms, my atoms would be partly separated from each other, but would continue to go on endlessly through the universe long after I had ceased to exist. So I passed into the fullness of my adulthood without any need to believe in God, nor in any afterlife. I simply assumed I would live my years and I would inevitably die. My consciousness will be extinguished in the same manner as are the sounds and sights on a television screen, instantaneously fading to black nothingness when the switch is thrown off. But yet, but yet, we never lose anything that has ever been an important part of us. All of it just gets laid over by later experiences, by later beliefs. All of that has ever moved us continues then to remain in some kind of paradoxical jumble. So let me confess, at times I still have conversations with God, in whom I do not believe, the God of my early childhood. Since I'm getting elderly now, I often visit daydreams of my dying. In one of the daydreams, I find to my surprise that my consciousness did not blank out at the moment of death. Instead, I have become some kind of spirit and am transported to some other plane of existence. There I am welcomed warmly. I am brought before the God in whom I do not believe. He begins to speak, but I interrupt him with my own outbursts. Referring to my life just ended, I screamed at him, "What the hell was all of that? That was a bitch." At quieter times, I play a game with the God of my imagination. I tell him that I don't believe in him. I have no interest in honoring him. He couldn't possibly exist because he's so fucking inept. I could do a much better job of fulfilling his responsibilities than does he. I quote Woody Allen to him. If there is a God, she must have Alzheimer's. I sneer at him that I'm being blasphemous and enjoying it. If he's listening, he better send a lightning bolt into my window to kill me because I'm going to keep spreading the word that he doesn't exist. I wait a moment and then I go on. You see, you didn't smite me for my blasphemy. That's my final proof that you don't exist. At this juncture, I suddenly imagine God is laughing. Without words, he lets me know that he has a very warm spot in his heart for the defiant ones, for the rebels, for those who will stand up and protest. We are his favorites. He tells me most humans are schmucks, so he's created various religions with rules of conduct, belief systems, worship rituals, the various kinds of trappings to keep fools occupied and in line. Only the very special break out of those webs he designed. Only a few manage to seize the freedom to create their own existence. And of all humans, he loves us the best. So what am I? I am a Jew. I'm a non-Jew trapped in Jewishness. I hate being Jewish. I am proud to be a Jew, a member of a collective of souls, large numbers of whom have and continues to transform the world in better ways. I want to be one of them. I am a Jew who does not believe in God. I'm a secular atheist who talks to God occasionally. I know I am finite and that my consciousness will die at the moment of my death. There is no other life. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Wait, though, it's safest to believe in oncoming nothingness and that I'm at peace with my belief and no longer frightened by it. It's safest because I hate unpleasant surprises. I don't want to believe in heaven, in a life in some other plane, or in a transmigration of souls, or whatever the hell else, and find out that I've been a fool. But wait a minute, there is no unpleasant surprise. If I think I'm going to heaven when I die because death comes, and as I predict, all totally goes black, what the hell? Of course, there's no remaining consciousness. No more Arthur to experience any such unpleasant surprise. So I'll keep my non belief in place for sure. That way, any surprise that comes can only be a pleasant one. I was wrong. There is something after this life. And that's probably a ridiculous assertion as well. I must stop all of this. I can't natter on endlessly about my Jewishness, about souls, about deities, and about the convoluted nature of existence and of death. All that can come of it is that everything will cycle around and contradict everything else, and on and on. For me, there is no truth. There are no answers. A quote from T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock struggles into my consciousness instead. Life is not with a bang, but with a whimper. Now I must shut up. That is the end of that piece. So restroom. Oh, okay. Turn your mics on if either of you wants to say anything about this topic, because I'm going on to something entirely else now. So if you want to take a few moments to make any comments, that would be fine. Anybody?
There's a series called Band of Brothers. I don't know if you saw it, Aaron, but there's one episode that shows the Allies discovering a camp that had been deserted by the Germans,
Yeah.
and it really very, very explicitly shows what you were describing, Arthur.
Yes. Those are some of the most hideous images I carry from my childhood. Anything else about religious fervor, religious beliefs?
I just that triggered a memory for me. I remember watching. You guys remember the miniseries Holocaust?
Yes.
I was probably 6 or 7 watching it with my
Yes.
dad. And I remember the scenes of, dead bodies and really horrific stuff. And I remember my dad looked over at me and he said, I don't believe in God, and I sure as hell hope you don't. And I was already
Well,
questioning God.
for many people, the fact that God had allowed the chosen people to go through all that, and so many of them to get exterminated, was proof that there was no God.
Yeah, my grandparents were pretty much they had all lost the faith because 99% of the family were all wiped out.
Oh yeah.
If you were to choose an afterlife, Arthur, and it was entirely up to you, what would that be?
Oh, all right. This may sound strange that I simply be allowed to go on with what I'm doing now, open-ended for an eternity. I don't
Mhm.
need to change anything. I don't need any special heaven. I'm not
You mean
interested in that.
you don't want to spend all eternity in some big grand living room with all of your relatives forever?
No.
Hmm. You
There-
don't want to be a hawk that sort of like, swoops down and
No. There's a famous Jewish joke I feel like telling now since this question was asked of me. Rabbi Chaim Stein, who grew up in a small shtetl in Poland, dies in about 1875, and he is worshipped and by his congregation. They thought he was really a very special rabbi and a holy man. And they had no doubt he was going to heaven. And sure enough, after being unconscious for a while, he wakes up and he's in heaven, and there's an angel greeting him and complimenting him on the beauty and sanctity of the life he had lived, and saying that he would now be able to spend eternity in heaven. And there were a variety of ways he could spend his time now in heaven, but they were going to show him to his quarters. And then, if there's any special desire he had now that he was in heaven, what would be the first thing he wanted to do? And he thought for a second and said, well, that's very nice. Show me my quarters. And then I would like to go off. And I assume Rabbi Ginsburg is here. He was my mentor while I was growing up. He ran the training academy for me. I learned everything about the Torah for him. He was one of the most wonderful and interesting men I have ever met. Is he here? And could I talk to him? And the angel said, oh, yes, he's here. He's very special. We've given him a very wonderful place to live, and we honor him. He's continuing his studies while he's here. And if you want to talk to him, I'm sure he'd be happy to see you again. And unpack your bags, and I will walk you over to where he is. So they walk him over to where Rabbi Ginsburg is. It's almost like a Greek temple up on the top of a hill with a beautiful view of all kinds of expanses of things. And there are no doors because the climate is very temperate and everything is open and it's pleasant in there. And he's at the back. There's a small desk at this back of this huge hall that's full of sculptures and beauties of various kinds. So the younger rabbi who just died walks up to approaches his desk, and Rabbi Ginsburg looks up and says, oh, it's you, my pupil. You've aged, but I recognize you immediately. You were always my favorite pupil. He said, it's so nice to have you here. What can I do for you this afternoon? He said, well, I was always perplexed of this chapter in the Torah. I never understood fully what it meant. Could we go over it together? It would really please me for you to untangle the mystery for me now. Yes, of course, I'll do that. Sit down, make yourself comfortable. Let me go through the scrolls here and find out where this passage is. And as the younger rabbi sits down, he looks over, and in the background, somewhere off to the left of the elder rabbi, there's a very lascivious blonde woman. She's very voluptuous, and she's lying on a chaise lounge, and she's moaning, and she's masturbating, and she's playing with herself, and obviously very sexually aroused. So the younger rabbi turns to the older rabbi and said, "Do you know her?" "Yes, she's here with me." She, the younger rabbi said, Is she your blessing? Is she your special goodness now that you're in heaven? He said, no, you don't understand. I'm her curse. So I like that joke. All right, moving right along. I'm going to an entirely different topic now. It is the creative use of airplane tickets. That's my next topic. Uh, I'll start with a more recent episode first. 2 times in my life, I have actually given an airplane ticket to a client. No, no psychologist does that. What psychologist gives airplane tickets to clients? Well, here's one. And here is the second case. And this one had a bad outcome, unfortunately. I had a new client who approached me, what, it's maybe 30 years ago now. And she said that she had been referred by a former client of mine. She was a married woman. She lived up in Topanga Canyon. She lived simply in a kind of rural area. And she didn't have much family income. I didn't charge her very much. She had a husband and 2 children. Both she and her husband worked for the telephone company, and both of them were equipment installers. She was a pioneer in some ways. Even though she was a woman, she had a technical job working for the telephone company in a blue collar position. She was doing internal installation. She was hooking up telephone lines in houses and hooking up instruments and answering machines to those telephone lines, checking for when lines went bad in the house. Her husband was a linesman. He was up on telephone poles, doing important things with a great stretch of the telephone lines in distant locations and up in the air. So they lived together, and they had 2 daughters who were early teenagers. Uh, she was miserably unhappy. She didn't like her work particularly, even though the family was dependent on their 2 incomes in order to make life possible for them. They had some daydreams that they were going to be sending their daughters to college, and they needed to earn every penny that they were earning. She didn't like her work. She was capable at it, but it certainly was not soul nourishing in any way. And she was suffering from what was very common 30 years ago. She had a very traditional marriage, even though she contributed a good share of the financial support to the family. Her husband made all the decisions. He was the man, and he decided how they were going to live, who was going to do what for whom, and on and on. Uh, she did not only her own work, but probably 70 to 80% of the work necessary to run the household and keep things going. She did all the cooking, all the cleaning, all the marketing, all the shopping. He, as soon as he got home from work, he was off on his own. He could do whatever he wanted. He had several things he liked doing. He had a full workshop out in the garage. He did like doing woodworking. So when he came home from work, while she was cooking or getting ready for dinner, he was often back working on some wooden assemblage that he was making. He also loved motorcycle riding, and he had a motorcycle for himself and a second one for her if she wanted to accompany him. And often, since they were up in Topanga where it was beautiful, he'd come home at the end of the day and say he was going for an hour's motorcycle ride. She shouldn't rush dinner because he wanted to see the beginning of the sunset from the top of the mountainside before the sun set. And he would go off and just ride his motorcycle. And they both had 2 weeks vacation every year, but he decided what they were going to do for the 2 weeks vacation. And usually it was to go somewhere where they could do hill climbing on the motorcycles. That's what he wanted to do for vacation. And they would camp out because camping out was less expensive, and they would ride the motorcycles. They would take them on the back of his truck. He had racks for the motorcycles to take. And she would have to again be in charge of running the campsite, doing all the cooking, doing all the practical things while the kids lollygagged around and he rode his motorcycle. And she was on duty all the time. She did 70% of all the maintenance activity, and she was very depressed. So I said, "Was this what you wanted to do while you were growing up?" And she said, "No, what she really liked was art. Her father was a painter, actually, and her father had some success. He got some things that he was able to sell. He had a career as a handyman. That's what he did to support the family. And mom worked too, but he had a studio and he made paintings. And after school, she would come and watch him paint, and he would try and teach her about painting. And she would tell him, could she have one of the canvases, and she could try painting. He said, no, no, this is for men. Women don't do this kind of thing. And once in a while, she'd sneak in there and steal some paints and try and make something on a comic canvas. And he would always deride her and tell her that that was crap. She had no talent. She should stop that, give it up. She needed to do something practical. Maybe she should go to typing school or something like that. She'd get away from him and get away from art. Art was not meant for women. There were no successful women artists. And so he crushed her spirit about art. Nevertheless, she still loved art. Once in a while, she could get some free time, and she would go to LACMA if there was an exhibit, or to the Museum of Modern Art. And she would love looking at the exhibits and what was there, and love looking at what was happening in art, and still hungered maybe to do something with art, even though she felt cut off and without the resources to be able to do that. And so I thought she could use some help. I decided to put her in group therapy. I was very active with group therapy back then. I had several women in a group, and they were the oncoming generation. They were liberating themselves. They were not going to take crap from men. They were going to demand equality, and they were going to demand the right to follow their own hearts. And I thought it would be useful, since her mother was not that kind of woman, it would be useful to have a few older women around who would support her and tell her that she needed to try and assert herself better and try and get more for herself out of what she felt, and not feel like the purpose of her life was to satisfy her husband's wishes and to satisfy her girls' wishes. She had a right to have some wishes of her own. And sure enough, as she came into a group, she started to listen, and there started to be more dissension between her and her husband. She was beginning to push back at him some. She was beginning to fight with him about what they did for summer vacations, for instance. She even had the audacity to say she wanted to go. She had exhausted for the time being the art museums that were here in Los Angeles. She wanted to go to a different city. Could they go to San Francisco for their vacation? Maybe she could see some of the art that was hung there. Could she go to New and see the Metropolitan Museum? Could she see the Museum of Modern Art? And he was fighting with her. He was telling her, who's putting these ridiculous ideas in her head? Why should they waste hundreds of dollars transporting the family to places like that so she could look at art? That was not a reasonable thing to spend money on. And he was again beginning to argue with her. And so she was quite despairing about how could she liberate herself. And then one of the members of the group said, I think I could help you. Would you be willing to go without your husband and family? Would you be willing to go somewhere? And she said, well, I don't know. Where could I go? He said, well, I was thinking about you. My family is fairly well to do. My parents own a summer cottage on the Jersey Shore in South New Jersey, and they don't use it all summer. He said, if you have 2 weeks off, I think I could arrange that they would, if I asked them, they would do this for you. That you could go to the Jersey Shore and have 2 weeks by yourself there on the on the seacoast, on the Atlantic seacoast in New Jersey. And it's only about 40 minutes into Philadelphia from there. You could probably rent a car. And if you wanted some time off during the day, you could drive into Philadelphia and you could go to the Philadelphia Art Museum. There's a very wonderful one there. And if you're willing to drive an hour and a half to 2 hours, you could go up the Jersey Turnpike into New York City. It's there too. It's within a reasonable commute. You could make a round trip during the day and you could nourish yourself to your heart's content in whatever museums there are in New York, and then go back to the cottage on the beach at night to go to sleep again that day. And she began to get very tempted. She said, how would I pay for that? I don't have the money to buy an airplane ticket. He said, well, it won't cost you anything to stay in the house. My parents won't charge you. You're gonna have to go. There's a market nearby. You're gonna have to buy food, but you're gonna have to eat food whatever you do those 2 weeks. And then I came up with the idea. I said, I'll give you an airplane ticket. You don't need to pay for an airplane ticket. I'll give you one. And are you willing to go if you have a free airplane ticket and free lodging in that place on the shore there in New Jersey? And she said, yeah, I think I could do that. Well, I said, it's going to be very difficult. You're going to have to tell your husband you're not taking the 2 weeks vacation with him. And you're going to have to tell your daughters you're not going with them anywhere either. You're going to give yourself some time off to consume art this summer. And you're going to the New Jersey shore, but you're probably going to see art museums in both New York City and in Philadelphia. And that's what you're going to do with your 2 weeks. You think you'd have the courage that you could rebel and defy them and do that? He said, maybe I could. So the plans went forward. I made her the reservation and I gave her the ticket. Was easy to do. I said, I have almost 200,000 miles of frequent flyer points. This is not going to cost me anything. Don't worry about hurting me in any way by taking the ticket. I can get you the ticket. There won't be any cost to me. So I'll get you the free ticket and I'll give it to you. And please have a wonderful time. And about 2 days after I gave her the ticket, I felt regret, strangely enough, not about having given her the ticket, but what I was asking her to do. She had never been on an airplane in her life. I was asking her to make her way to the airport, to get her luggage on the plane, to figure out what to do when she got to her destination. The plane was going to fly to Philadelphia, and she had to get from Philadelphia by some kind of transportation to the cottage on the seacoast. And how was she going to move around when she was there? And I said, you know what? I'm like a parent who's sending my child to do something my child has never done. And I'm acting like somehow she should know how to do this when nobody's ever asked her to learn how to do this. That's not good. Because I remembered I was going to take clarinet lessons in downtown Los Angeles. And my mother says there's a bus stop on the corner. Just take the bus downtown and get off and go to your clarinet lesson. I had never been downtown on the bus in my life. I was terrified. I was terrified I was going to get lost. I was going to get kidnapped. That was one of the scariest things I ever had to do. And I didn't want to put my client through that. So I sat down and I remembered every step. If you're going to Lax, where do you park? Should she park at the airport? She's going to be gone for 2 weeks. That might be expensive. Probably better if she takes a cab. Where does she get a cab? Who are the cab companies that will pick her up? What is the airline? She should tell them what terminal is it in. Where should the cab let her off? What does she do with her bags? So I wrote her this long analysis of every step of the way. When you get to the airport, I would urge you, if you could, to pack in 2 smaller bags and not take too much luggage, because then you could take everything on the flight with you. You won't have to check any bags. You're just carrying them on with you. And you put one in an overhead bin over your seat and the other one under the seat. But if you have too much, if you're taking a lot here, there's going to be a bellman stand near the door of the terminal. You take the big bag there and you check it in, and he puts a sticker on your ticket. I explained everything to her. You're going to need a boarding pass. You have to go up to the ticket counter. There were no electronic things back then. You have to go up to the ticket counter with your ticket, show them the ticket that you have. They'll give you what's called a boarding pass. This lets you to go through the terminal and get to the gate. They'll tell you what gate it is, or if you look right over the ticket counter, there's a list of the departure gates. You can see what gate you're departing from, and you have to walk through the terminal to the gate. There'll be a lobby there to sit, and the person in the terminal will call you if you have your boarding pass. They'll start telling you when they're boarding your flight, and that's when you can get on the flight. I explained every step of the way. I said, you have a plane change in Chicago. Now, here's what you do when you get to Chicago, and the flight you're on to Chicago will let you off. You have to go back in the terminal, and then you have to look on the board and see where the connecting flight is. Your bags will be moved from one place to another. If you check baggage, if you're carrying baggage, you'll have to take the bags with you. I even wrote her about what happens if there's a problem, and due to weather delay, she can't get her connecting flight. I told her where she could check into a hotel and stay overnight until she could get a plane out the next day. And I gave her my frequent flyer numbers for the hotel so she could get into the hotel for free, and how she would get from the Chicago terminal to the hotel and then back again so she could get on her flight the next day. I tried to anticipate everything that could happen to her that could go wrong and have it described and listed for her so she would know exactly how to do that. I even told her about the takeoff. When the plane is rolling down the runway and beginning to take off, there'll be some turbulence. The plane will shake some, that's okay. And then as it begins to gain altitude, the wheels will be retracted and they'll thump as they get into the plane. That's not anything going on with the airplane. That's just the wheels being put into a receptacle for them in the wings of the plane. Don't worry about it. It'll be okay. I tried to be a kind parent who was by her side at every step of the way and could solve and answer any question she had about what to do. So off she went, and I waited eagerly for her return 2 weeks later. I couldn't wait for her to show up at group again. And in she came and she said, I did it. I went. And so I'm waiting to hear. And then she said, I didn't do it in the way I thought I was going to do it. I said, we all said to her, oh, what happened? She said, well, I told my husband and my daughters what I was going to do, that they were on their own for their vacation with each other, but I was going off by myself. And my daughter started to say, it's not fair. We want to go. That sounds wonderful to be on the Atlantic coast right there on the sand and have a summer cottage right there on the Atlantic Ocean where the waves are. We want to go too. It's not fair for you to go off and do this. You need to take us. And she said, well, this is being paid for. I don't have to pay for this. And they said, well, find some way to pay for us and take us too. And that woman used up the rest of the money in her savings account, and she bought tickets for her two daughters to go with her. She sold out and became their mother, who was going to give them a wonderful summer vacation on the East Coast. And off they went, and she spent 14 days in that house on the coast, going to the market, cooking meals to the girls, running the washing machine to clean up the clothing that they were making, watching them have a wonderful, wonderful 2 weeks of summertime vacation while she was the servant wench again and took care of them. She never went in to see any art gallery. She didn't go into Philadelphia. She didn't go into New York. She just did what was usual for her, as if they had been at home. She was carrying out the same functions, except now she was carrying out those functions in the home on the seacoast in New Jersey. I got very depressed listening to all that. And I think she knew she had disappointed all of us, including herself. I didn't scold her. I didn't tell her she was a bad person. I didn't tell her I was disappointed, although I'm sure I couldn't conceal my disappointment because I was thinking that would have been a wonderful step towards making a better life for herself and valuing her right to have some experiences that were worthwhile for her. She hadn't been able to do that. I had to try and figure out some other way forward. and use this as a learning experience. I had asked too much of her too fast and in too complicated a fashion. She was unable to do that. I had to find some simpler things that she could do at home that would not be so jarring to the family system. Well, 3 weeks later, she said the family was having economic reverses now and she was leaving group. And that was the last I saw her. I had a horrible failure experience. And I believed that she really left group because she was ashamed that she had disappointed me, that she had failed herself, and that I was upset with her and the group was upset with her. So the safest thing for her to do was to disappear and go back into her former life. And that's my terrible story. You can turn on your sound again for a while, and I'll tell the second version of this in a while.
Arthur, you didn't fail.
I didn't fail.
You didn't fail. You know, it seemed like that it was more important to you that she do all these things and that she get a chance to really kind of like treat herself.
Yes.
But could it be that what was most important to her, what was most significant to her, and what was more significant than, you know, going to the art museum and appreciate art and even being an artist, was being a mother, and being a mother to those two little girls, and that in some ways that to have an opportunity to be with them on the East Coast and to take care of them was more significant and more precious than anything that she would do on her own. And so in some ways it would maybe conceivably more important to you that she do this, and thus it's a failure,
Yep.
but it isn't. In some ways the glaring, you know, the glaring truth is that what's important, what was most important in her life was being a mother.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's a lovely comment, and I'll try and take some comfort from it. But you reminded me of some facts I didn't sufficiently tell you about the case.
Oh.
Uh, Being a mother was indeed very important to her. And often she sounded and acted like she had given up on herself, that she herself was never going to have a fulfilling life, but maybe through her children, they would do important things and they would have good lives and she would try and facilitate their becoming. You're right, that was an important project for her, but I didn't like the reasons for it because it represented a giving up on herself and giving herself any experiences that felt nourishing to her own soul. The second thing I didn't talk about before is they were horrible to her. They exploited her. They were never grateful. She never did enough. And they joined their father in berating her and telling her what a stupid person she was. They were not very friendly or kind to her.
Mm.
So I don't think they deserve this kind of consideration. It's fine with me if she had told them to go fuck themselves.
Well, you can fly a person to the museum, but you can't make them look.
Thank you. That's wonderfully witty.
Also, I wonder, in a way, this is a bit of a throwback to some of the earlier conversations. But you had mentioned when you were in psychoanalysis that moment where your therapist showed you the best way to get somewhere. He gave you the details on how to avoid the traffic and be there on time. It's almost like you replicated that for your
Yes,
client
I
at
did.
a much more personal level.
Yeah.
And maybe that was the bigger gift for her too. Like Scott was saying, that there was some success and that you really showed her how much you cared and believed in her.
And unfortunately, I lost track of her. I don't know where she is, and I'll never know how the rest of her life is played out.
And maybe kind of like as Aaron was saying, the kind of like another significant gift that you provided for her was, you know, for that moment or for that weekend or whatever, you know, you were the giving, doting parent.
Yes, I was. I wanted to
She
be.
was the 8, 9-year-old who had never gone anywhere by herself, and
Yep.
you were showing her the way every
Yes.
single step.
Yes. And I wanted that to be the beginning of her building a much more fulfilling life for herself. And I'll never know whether that had any impact on her whatsoever or not. So what do you think the Board of Psychology would think about my giving her an airplane ticket and detailed instructions about how to move around?
Something less than an A plus.
Well, maybe they would let it go because it was all on miles.
I don't think so. No, the Board of Psychology gets very frightened if you do anything that's not what psychologists usually do. I violated the standard of care. No psychologist gives airplane tickets to clients. What the hell is that?
Where did that thought come from for you, Arthur?
That's the other case I need to talk about because I had a very, very, very successful experience in giving somebody an airplane ticket. So I thought I was going to have a second very successful experience. And much to my dismay, I had what felt like wreckage to me. It got off the rails entirely in ways I hadn't anticipated. So now I need to talk about, well, what name shall I give him? Dustin. I'll call him Dustin. I don't know why. My God, I've known Dustin for 68 years. I've known Dustin. He came into my life about 2 years after I went into practice. I was not enthusiastic about receiving him. It was his wife who got in touch with me and said that they had been married for a few years and the marriage was not going well. And she was thinking about divorce, but she knew something about psychology. Maybe it would be helpful if they could talk to somebody before she would get so despairing that she needed to get a divorce. And would I see the two of them? And I was just beginning to experiment some with family therapy and couples therapy. I'd had no training in it whatsoever when I was in graduate school, but there was a rampage going on in the literature and much growing attention in our young field back then with these new modalities and new ways of working with people that weren't simply based on seeing a single person for a unit of care. So I agreed, as much for my own selfishness, I was going to learn something from this as a real willingness to try and be of some help. I didn't know what I was getting into. And when they showed up, I didn't like what I was getting into. He was the quintessential man of the I guess it was the 60s back then. Yeah. Uh, he he was a young Jewish man. He had grown up on the streets of Boyle Heights. He had grown up fairly poverty stricken. His father had abandoned the family when he was 4 years old, and he had grown up in a one-bedroom apartment with his mother, his sister, and his aunt. There were three women in it, and he slept on a mattress on the living room floor. And he struggled as best he could in school. Most of the time, he was on the streets of Boyled Heights, trying to stay away from the Latino gangs who were coming in larger and larger number, and trying to survive and figure out what to do with his life. And part of him was admirable. He had managed to finish high school, and at the time I met him, he was a senior in Los Angeles. What was it? Uh, it's the LA College System campus in East Los Angeles. He was going to college and trying to get a degree as best he could. He was getting a degree in business. She was really unhappy with him because he was silent, he was austere. She was hungry for intimacy and warmth with him. All he could do was have instrumental conversations with her. If she was upset about something, he didn't know how to respond to her. He tried to just give her some solution and get rid of her to stop complaining. He wanted a division of labors. He was not helpful at all in trying to attend to the apartment. They were thinking about getting pregnant, and she was really worried about what kind of father he was going to be. She didn't like many of his personality traits, his reserve, his privacy, his unresponsiveness, his lack of warmth. She knew he was kind and decent in many ways. He represented reasonable values, but he was just not present emotionally for her. And I despaired. I didn't think he'd ever overcome that. But I started working with him. And to my surprise, he proved to be more flexible than I thought he was going to be. He began to listen. He began to learn how to talk to her. He was open to renegotiation, whatever was their chores and workload that they took on for each other. He graduated college. He found a job as an assistant and for a man who was a represented mills. He sold fabric, and my client became the assistant. He maintained the sample books. He made appointments for his boss to show up to show fabric. Once in a while, he would be sent to show some fabric to somebody. So he was learning the fabric business, and he was making a better wage. And the woman did become pregnant. They said goodbye to me. I didn't think I'd ever see them again. And I was happy. They seemed to really be on a better path and seemed to be progressing and taking hold of life and rising to the challenges that were appropriate for them at the age they were in. And then, to my surprise, they came back. And it wasn't because there was a problem in the marriage anymore. They had had their first child. The problem was she had a cancer diagnosis. What did she have? She had Hodgkin's lymphoma. And she was scared, and he was upset. And could I just see them and be there and try and help them to figure out how to resolve this, what to do with the child, and how they were going to get through the challenge, and what was the hell was going to happen if she died. And I was on duty for about a year and a half, and she had lots of radiation, and she fought off the illness. It went into remission, and they were okay again. And they said goodbye to me again, thanking me for having kept them company and helping them to preserve their sanity while they went through this terrible challenge. And at that point, they were pregnant with a second child. So they wound up with a female and then a male, and off they went. And they came back again. Uh, this time, there was a crisis in his life. Uh, his mother had committed suicide, and he didn't know how to respond to his sister, whom he hated. He didn't have much of a conversation with that, and uh, he needed to try and figure out how to grieve and mourn and do what he needed to do. He started to say to me, I hate people who commit suicide. They're ugly, they're angry, they do terrible things to everybody. I want to kill my mother for killing herself. So I happen to agree with him, by the way. And I kept him company while he went through his grieving, reoriented his life, got his sister, managed his mother's estate, got his sister situated somewhere, and then pulled back from her and resumed his life. By this time, his boss was getting ready to retire and asked him if he wanted to take over the business, the fabric business, and he would sell it to him at a reasonable price. And would he like to rise in the world and take that over? So he did. He took over the fabric business and started to make a better living. And I was very happy for him. And his children were developing in a reasonable fashion. And I'm telling you, over and over again, he would show up in my life at the next crisis. So, what was the next crisis? As a result of all the radiation that his wife had been given to her chest because the Hodgkin's lymphoma nodes, the main nodes that were infested with cancer, were in her chest. So they were firing lots of X-rays into treatment into her chest over and over again. Her lungs had gotten scarred from the radiation. Yes, it had saved her life, but she was walking with scars on her aorta and scars on her lungs. So she had a kind of brittle asthma. She was prone to having asthma attacks, and sometimes she would have to be rushed to the emergency room so that they could give her steroids and pull her back from the brink of whatever she was going through. And he was very frightened at what seemed to be his wife's declining health. Uh, so I helped him work through the scenarios. What would happen if she died one day? What was he going to do? What was the plan? How was he going to take care of his children? What would she do if she lived? How would they make a better life? What could they do to celebrate her return to health? And she came back from the brink of death, and on we went some more. And I didn't see him again until he was now 42 and she was about 41. And now she had had a very serious asthma attack and she was in the ICU at Cedars when he came back to see me. And he said he was frightened. He was afraid she wasn't going to make it this time. And I told him I'd be there. I'd help him find his way. I hoped he was wrong and she would come back from the brink like she had so many other times. But his first wife died. She did die. And he was a mess. He started to abuse marijuana. For the first 2 weeks, he couldn't pay any attention. His oldest child was now an early teenager, and his youngest one was far into elementary school. He was useless. They were fending for themselves. His daughter was trying to take care of the son. He was just a mess. And I helped him find his strength again and find his way to live. And he had a ceremony where he burned all her medications. That seemed to be a turning point. He took all the pills they had been giving her to try and fight her various ailments and difficulties, and he had a huge bonfire and burned all that up, and brought his children to burn the medicines, and they were going to start a new life. Off he went, and he said, "I'm not ready to be alone. Can I stay with you for a while?" And I said, "Of course, come regularly." So there he was coming to my appointment with me once a week. And one day in the waiting room, as he was leaving, there was a woman in the waiting room. And this is a case I presented. This was the case of the very obese man who I tried to help lose weight, and he died on the operating table. So I was seeing his widow, and she had two children also. And I was seeing his widow and seeing my widower. And wonder of wonders, I had not planned this, but I was seeing them back to back on the same day. So he's going out through the waiting room, and there she was. And he came back the next week and said, "You had somebody in your waiting room when I left." I said, "Yes." He said, "She looked like a nice woman." I said, "Yes, so?" He said, "Would you mind if I dated her?" I said, "Oh, the life force is coming back in you. You feel ready to start seeing somebody?" He said, "Maybe I could do that." And I said, "So you're asking me for permission whether you can date her?" He said, "Yes." And I said, "I don't own her. Why would you need my permission to date her?" He said, "Well, is this going to cause some kind of complication? I assume she's somebody you're seeing. Is that going to make a problem for you if I see her and she sees me and we start dating each other?" I said, "Well, yeah, maybe it could make a problem." I said, "What kind of problem do you think it could make?" And he said, "Well, maybe we'll start hurting each other, being mean to each other, and we'll both come in and start complaining to you about how terrible the other person is." And I said, "Well, yeah, that could happen." He said, "Would that be all right if that happened?" I said, "Well, I wouldn't hope that that would be the outcome. But again, why you keep asking me for permission? I don't own her and I don't own you." So I was thinking about the board of psychology all the time. What the hell should I say about two clients who have met in a waiting room and want to start dating? What's the protocol for what you do about this? I didn't have any. So I decided I would do nothing. I would neither encourage it nor discourage it. I would let happen whatever was going to happen. And they started seeing each other and they started enjoying each other. And both she and he got significantly lighter. And after a while, he said, I'm going to ask her to come live with me and my kids and bring her kids along too. You know, she has two kids. That we're going to move in together. I said, oh. And he said, well, don't you have anything more to say than that? I said, well, that feels like it's meaningful to both of you. Who am I to tell you not to do that? You don't have any cautions you're going to urge us? And I said, no, I don't think so. I trust you to find your way. You've been doing that so far in your relationship. It seems to be working well. And go ahead and proceed. So I will end on that point, and you will find out where the first time actually, of my using an airplane ticket came up in this case. But this is the case I have been in and out of for the longest period of my life. I've known him most of my adult years. He's come for episode after episode. Whenever there's a twist, a turn, something new shows up, he's back in my life again for a day, a week, a month, sometimes several months, sometimes a few years, and then he disappears again. So I will continue to talk about this case in the time ahead, and even why the airplane ticket was so significant in saving his life. And we will go on from there next week, but I will stop and let you make any comments you want to about this particular strange case.
I really like this case because in some ways that he's been with you for so long, and that he's utilized, you as a kind of like an invaluable resource, Arthur,
Yeah.
and that in some ways that you're a very significant part of his life.
I am indeed.
Yeah.
The
You
story
really
as
are
you
the family
hear it is,
doctor.
well, the story you're going to hear is he's become a significant part of my life too. That's another unusual twist in this story. Nobody else has, as he has become a significant person in my life, but he has. And I think the turning point was the airplane ticket. So we'll get to that next week.
That's a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
Any other comments about this one? Okay, to be continued next week. I'll look forward to it.
All
Have a
right.
good afternoon.
Okay, you too. All
Good
right.
seeing you guys.
Bye now.